Emily and Mark hid a terrifying secret for years behind the mask of normal parents. They forced their own child into a world no one should ever know existed. This is the shocking story of survival, fear, and the dark truth they tried to keep buried. From the outside, the house looked like any other in the quiet neighborhood. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the paint fresh, and the windows always gleaming in the sun. Neighbors waved politely when passing by, unaware of the darkness lurking behind the front door. Inside, however, everything was different. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the rooms felt like traps rather than places of safety. As a child, I never understood why I constantly felt on edge, why even the smallest misstep could earn sharp looks or worse. My parents smiled for photos, but behind that veneer was a world I could barely comprehend. There were rules, unspoken yet enforced, that left no room for freedom or innocence. Strangers would come to the house, adults who seemed ordinary to anyone else, but their presence was terrifying. I was instructed to obey without question, to act as though everything was normal, even when it felt completely wrong. At first, I thought maybe I had imagined it, that these feelings of dread were a child's overactive imagination. But the unease never left me, and the glimpses of my parents' secret life grew clearer with every passing year. The adults who came to the house were not just visitors, they were part of a network I was slowly being forced into. Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary weekend carried the invisible weight of fear. I was learning quickly that the world I thought I knew was a lie. I remember small moments that should have been joyful, but were tainted by confusion and fear. A family dinner, laughter that felt forced, a sudden knock at the door that made my stomach twist. My parents' smiles never reached their eyes, and their words often contained hidden threats disguised as advice. I was a pawn in a game I didn't understand, and any attempt to question or resist was met with subtle punishment or manipulation. Over time, I learned to mask my feelings, to present a face of normalcy to the outside world while living in constant terror at home. The walls seemed to close in with every secret, every lie, every hidden truth I was forced to witness. Even as a child, I began to notice patterns, the ways my parents controlled not just my body, but my mind. I understood that safety was conditional, that trust could be weaponized. And though I didn't yet have the words to describe it, I knew something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. That knowledge followed me everywhere, a shadow I could never shake, shaping every thought, every action, every breath I took within the house that should have been my sanctuary. As I grew older, the truth about my parents became impossible to ignore. What I had once felt as vague fear transformed into a terrifying understanding. The house I lived in was only one piece of a much larger hidden world. It was a network of adults who preyed on children, people who smiled in public and acted normal, but hid dark, disturbing lives behind closed doors. I started noticing subtle patterns: strangers arriving at odd hours, whispered instructions, and strict rules about what I could say or do. My parents made it clear that no one outside could ever know, and I learned early that secrecy was not optional, it was survival. The adults who came to our home were part of something organized and deliberate. They were careful, often charming in public, but their intentions were horrifying. I realized I was not just being abused in isolation. I was being groomed and used as part of a network of people who believed they could remain invisible. It was overwhelming to understand that the world I had trusted, the neighbors, teachers, even some extended family, might never see the truth. I felt trapped in a maze with no exit, every corner filled with danger. The fear was constant, gnawing at me every day, and I learned to anticipate the arrival of someone new, to brace myself for what would come next. I also began noticing how my parents manipulated my mind. They taught me that I had a role to play, that obedience and silence were measures of love, that survival depended on hiding the reality of our lives. There was never any room for refusal or questions, only compliance and shame. I became a spectator to their twisted world, a young person forced to navigate complex, horrifying dynamics I wasn't ready to understand. Each visit from another adult reinforced the idea that I was part of something much bigger, and that my life had been stolen before I even had a chance to live it. The isolation was suffocating. At school, I pretended to be normal, laughing with classmates and completing homework, while inside, I was constantly on edge, haunted by memories I could never share. Every relationship was filtered through fear, every gesture scrutinized for what it revealed about my life. The world outside seemed like a fragile shield, a temporary refuge I could never fully trust. I began to realize that my childhood was not just stolen, it had been weaponized. I was a tool in a network of predators, and the truth of it would remain hidden unless something or someone intervened. The realization was chilling. My parents' control was far-reaching, and escaping their influence would require more courage and cunning than I thought I possessed. As I entered my teenage years, the weight of my childhood became unbearable. The house that had always felt like a prison seemed to tighten its grip with every passing year. I began looking for small ways to escape, desperate for even a moment of freedom. But every plan was shadowed by fear. My parents had trained me well. I knew that any hint of defiance would bring consequences far worse than I could imagine. Still, I tried. I found myself lingering near the front door, waiting for an opportunity to run, or staying close to windows, hoping for a glimpse of the world outside that wasn't tainted by their control. School became my fragile refuge. It was a place where I could breathe, pretend, and for a few hours, feel like a normal teenager. But even there, I was constantly on edge. Teachers occasionally glanced at me with curiosity or concern, and classmates sometimes asked questions about my home life. Each time, my stomach tightened, and I had to lie convincingly to hide the horrors that were my everyday reality. Any slip could unravel everything. I became a master of masks, wearing a face of normalcy, while inside, anxiety and terror simmered constantly. The adults in my parents' network were meticulous. They monitored my movements and behavior, teaching me that freedom was an illusion. I realized that even the smallest act of rebellion could be detected. Each failed attempt to escape was met with manipulation, promises, threats, and subtle punishments that reminded me I was never truly safe. Yet, the desire for freedom grew stronger. I began memorizing routines, noticing patterns in the arrivals and departures of the adults, and searching for moments when I might slip away unnoticed. The tension was constant, a pressure that made every decision feel like a life or death gamble. There were moments of near discovery that made my heart pound with terror. Once, a neighbor nearly saw me trying to leave, and I froze, terrified of what my parents would do if they found out. Another time, a teacher questioned me directly about bruises I couldn't explain, forcing me to invent stories on the spot. Each close call reinforced the reality that I was trapped in a web of surveillance and manipulation. Every day was a careful balancing act, walking between obedience and survival, secrecy and the desperate desire to be free. In these moments, I understood the depth of their control and the extent to which my life had been stolen. But I also began to sense a tiny spark of determination, the belief that someday, somehow I could reclaim a life that was mine. As I entered the later years of my teenage life, the cracks in my parents' carefully constructed world began to show. What had once seemed invincible, their control, their secrecy, their network of predators started to falter. Small mistakes, hidden evidence, and a few careless actions created openings that no one had anticipated. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A neighbor noticing something odd, a distant relative asking questions, a teacher pressing for details I couldn't reveal. Each observation, each moment of suspicion, was a thread that threatened to unravel the twisted fabric of my childhood. One day, it became undeniable. An outsider finally began connecting the dots, noticing the patterns that I had learned to ignore or suppress. The adults who had once seemed untouchable were suddenly vulnerable to exposure. The house, once a fortress of fear, became a trap for my parents. I watched as the first real steps toward justice were taken. Evidence that had long been hidden, photographs, written accounts, suspicious financial transactions surfaced. Authorities began to investigate, and for the first time in years, I felt a sliver of hope. My parents tried to cover their tracks, manipulating memories and lying to anyone who asked questions. But the truth was persistent. The network they relied on began to crumble, and the terrifying illusion of control started to dissolve. With the walls of secrecy falling, I began to reclaim a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. Every piece of evidence confirmed what I had always known. I was not imagining the horrors I had endured. The adults who had haunted my childhood were being exposed, and the system was beginning to respond. The relief was accompanied by a new kind of fear of retaliation, fear of confrontation, fear of the emotional weight of finally facing the full truth. But with that fear came clarity. I realized that my life, stolen and manipulated for so long, could now take a different path. I could speak, I could testify, I could survive. This turning point was not sudden, it was gradual, built from months of investigations, interviews, and relentless uncovering of secrets. Each revelation carried its own shock, its own challenge to accept. But as the truth emerged, I began to understand that justice was possible, that the control my parents had exerted over my life was not absolute. For the first time, I imagined a future beyond fear, a future in which I could reclaim my voice and begin to heal. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, the darkness that had dominated my life was finally being confronted, piece by piece, until I began to see the faintest light at the end of the tunnel. After the investigation, life changed in ways I could never have imagined. The household that had been my prison was dismantled, and my parents were finally held accountable. Yet, freedom did not erase the scars. The trauma I had carried for years could not be washed away overnight. Therapy became my anchor, a space where I could unpack the fear, shame, and confusion that had been forced upon me. Each session revealed layers of experiences I had buried, memories I had learned to ignore just to survive. It was painful, but slowly, I began to understand that these experiences did not define who I was, they were part of a past I could now confront. Support came from unexpected places. Friends, distant relatives, and professionals became the pillars I leaned on. I discovered a world beyond the shadow of my parents' network, a world where safety and trust were possible. Every small step learning to sleep without fear, speaking openly about my experiences, asserting boundaries felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that had been stolen. The process was neither fast nor easy, but with every passing day, the constant weight of fear began to lift, replaced by cautious hope. I realized that surviving the worst possible circumstances did not mean I had to carry them forever. It meant I could choose a life beyond them. Even as I rebuilt my life, the echoes of the past remained. Nightmares, flashbacks, and moments of anxiety reminded me of how deeply my childhood had been affected. But each time these memories surfaced, I faced them with a strength I never knew I possessed. I learned that empowerment was not about forgetting, it was about acknowledgement, confrontation, and taking control over what came next. I could not change what happened, but I could shape my future, reclaim my voice, and use my story as a warning and a beacon. By the time I reached adulthood, I had begun transforming my pain into purpose. I spoke publicly about my experiences, sharing the story of the abuse and the network my parents had been part of. Each retelling strengthened my resolve, reminding me that I was no longer a victim silenced by fear. I could choose how to live, how to heal, and how to protect others from suffering in silence. The journey was long and painful, but it led to clarity. Survival was not just about enduring, it was about reclaiming life, and in doing so, transforming darkness into resilience. I emerged from the shadows not broken, but determined, carrying the knowledge that even the deepest wounds could be confronted, and even the darkest past could be transformed into a story of survival and hope.